Good morning and welcome to the Institute of Directors Conversation Series in conversation with Ian Shepherd. The average is always wrong. I am Raj Singh, Chairman of Institute of Directors Berkshire, and I am your host for today's conversation. Before I make a formal introduction and start the conversation, please may I take a few requests and outline the order of the service today. Please may I request you to turn off your audio and video to ensure that we can run this smoothly. Please may I also request you to use the chat function for asking questions to Ian from 9:25 onwards, because the actual Q&A will start at 9:30 a.m. Thank you very much for your support. In today's conversation, after a brief introduction, Ian will talk to us around his latest book, The Average is Always Wrong. Ian will start answering questions from 9:30 a.m. onwards till 9:55. And please may I request you to type in Q before your question so that we know that this is a question, not a general conversation in the chat room. At the end of the Q&A section, we will all come live. I would request you to turn on your videos at that time to take a virtual group photo, and then after a brief thank you conversation, we'll bring this webinar to an end by 10 a.m. sharp. On behalf of Institute of Directors and the present and future leaders attending the conversation, it is my pleasure to welcome Ian Shepherd, the CEO and CMO who has unique experience of leading data-centric organizations, as well as being a practitioner on data scientists area. Ian is a CEO and CMO who has held senior roles in a range of world-class consumer brands over the last 25 years. Starting his career in subscription media and technology business, including Sky and Vodafone, he has spent the last decade leading and advising retail and hospitality businesses, including game and audience. Operating at board level in both PLC and private equity environments, Ian has experienced firsthand the challenge that businesses face coping with new online competition, and also the remarkable turnaround that can be achieved when businesses succeed in reinventing themselves. Most recently, as CEO of the Odeon Cinema Group, he was a key member of the management team, which turned declining market share into growth and drove a dramatic profit improvement, leading to the successful sale of the business. So as you can see, Ian has the unique gift of sitting on both sides. He's now a non-executive director at Benson for Beds, and also is an advisor to a range of retail and technology businesses. The Average is Always Wrong is drawn from Ian's unusual combination of hands-on familiarity with data analytics and real boardroom experience. It is a practical and hands-on guide for leaders of business of every shape and size, and lays out how to turn data and analytics into real profit. Ian, welcome to the IoD Conversation Series. Thank you for being with us.
No, thank you for having me. Good morning, and good morning to everybody else as well.
So Ian, to start our conversation, it's a very, very standard way I start, and I will not make any difference for you this time as well. The first thing to come to you is, what prompted you to write The Average is Always Wrong? It's a very controversial headline.
Well, it is, and we'll come to the title in a second. First of all, I can see a couple of comments on the chat that the audio quality on the call is not great, but hopefully from my end at least, everybody can hear me, reasonably well. And yes, just to. Oh, bless, my audio is perfect, apparently. Thank you. Look, thank you for having me here this morning. It's terrific to be here, particularly under the umbrella of the IoD, which I think we're all on this call because we're in businesses of various types and various shapes and sizes, and that's exactly the kind of the audience that The Average is Always Wrong is aimed at. To your question about how do I come to write that book, I think it probably comes from, I have a slightly odd career of two halves in a way. I spent the first part of my career in subscription businesses, so in pay television and mobile and the mobile sector. And there's something quite interesting about subscription businesses, which is that you as a subscription business, you have customer data, so you know how long somebody's been a subscriber and what packages they take, and various bits of data like that. But you also have a huge financial incentive to understand your customers better. So you have a commercial incentive to keep customers for as long as you can. You want to spot bad debt early on. You want to be able to sell the right product, the right extra products to the right people at the right time. And so many of the things we're going to talk about this morning, the disciplines of data centricity, so the kind of the segmentation model, or the predictive model, or the machine learning and AI type of terminology, many of those things actually started in subscription businesses because of the kind of confluence of having data and having a reason to use it. And so, as for me, running strategy and data and then marketing teams in those sectors, that was a great kind of learning ground on what all this stuff was about. But then I suppose the second half of my career, coming into retail and hospitality businesses, that was quite an interesting kind of comparison point, because suddenly I found myself in businesses which, firstly probably had less data, and we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit as we go, but also had less experience of doing things with it. And so what I saw in many of those businesses, and continue to see in businesses that I work with now, was probably two things. Firstly, businesses making, to be honest, worryingly large decisions based on very cursory, summary overall statistics. And secondly, management teams that knew that there was more there than that knew that data centricity, that really getting under the skin of data was an important thing, and who had variously made investments, built databases, hired data scientists, but weren't really getting it to work, weren't really getting it to turn into profit, I suppose. And that was really the origin of the book, the desire to help businesses like the ones I was in, friends in adjacent sort of businesses and adjacent sectors, to say, how do we make this stuff actually work for us, and to bring some of the practical lessons from the early part of my career, but to write that with the perspective of, I've been CEO, I've been CMO, I've sat around the board table, so I understand in some senses some of the conversations that are going on there, and both why they're working and why they're not working. So that's I suppose what brings us here today.
Thank you, Ian. What about the title? Why is the average always wrong anyway?
Well, it's funny, isn't it? It's one of those things that, when you've kicked around in business for a while, I think you end up with just those phrases that stick in your head, and this was one for me that I've used a lot in different business circumstances. And I think if I was to try and deconstruct it, I suppose my thesis to the folks here on this call is that when you hear an average statistic, so our customers visit us on average 3 times a month, or we hold 2.5 weeks of stock in our business, a useful rule of thumb is that's either the answer to the wrong question or the wrong answer to your question, because all the interesting stuff, all the opportunities to turn data into money sits underneath that. You might be broadly happy with 2.5 weeks of stock holding in your business, but if there's one region or one product line or one part of your business where it's 22.5 weeks, you're going to want to find that, and you're going to want to dive in and do something about it, because that's working capital, that's just money tied up. And so the real data analytics, it's not about averages, it's about the kind of complicated wiggly lines, it's about the real granularity of the data, it's the world of scatter charts and statistical significance and all of that stuff, and it's the world of machine learning and AI, because frankly, when you get under the skin of the overblown terminology, what many machine learning techniques applied to business are about doing is they're about understanding that wiggly line and really getting into where are the patterns in the data and where are the pockets of data that look different to other things. And so, that's the world of the data centric business. And when you observe businesses that work in that way, and you see what they do, how they approach answering questions, how they approach forming strategies, it's so completely different than businesses that are content in a way with just looking at those overall summary statistics, that it's really worth understanding the difference and understanding that journey, I think would be my argument.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Thanks for a very comprehensive answer on that. What kind of data mistakes do you see business leaders making, and how would you guide them not to make them?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that I think the challenges that I see management teams wrestling with in, if we just in specifically this thing about becoming a data-centric business I'd probably split them into two. So the first piece is, for many businesses and many of the types of business represented on this call today, we might not have lots of data. We might not be awash with data that we think that we can interrogate. And, I use the example in the book of, the retail sector, which is one that I've spent quite a lot of time in and around. If let's draw the comparison. If I'm a pure play e-commerce retailer, you have to tell me who you are in order to buy from me. So I at least have your email address. I probably have your actual address. I know I've got a kind of record on my database of what you've bought from me at different points in time. So as if it wasn't bad enough that e-commerce retailers have all these structural advantages around costs and all the rest of it, the other advantage they have over the rest of us is that they have data comes out of the box, that they have a database. And so the very best e-commerce retailers are ruthless about using that advantage. And indeed, when you go to the extreme, the very best e-commerce retailers are essentially just data analytics businesses with shop fronts. But if you draw the comparison with, a high street retailer, whether that's a massive chain or whether it's, somebody with 3 stores, in a couple of neighboring market towns, I can walk into that store, I can buy a product for cash. I can walk out again. I haven't identified myself. You sold something, but you don't know that you sold it to me. I can come back in 2 weeks' time and buy something else. You're not building a record of my relationship with you as a customer. So because a lot of your world is essentially anonymous in that sense, the data thing just comes harder. And that is true of not just retail and hospitality businesses, it's true of all sorts of businesses that might be represented on this call, that we're not necessarily awash with data. And to the extent that we have data, we might know some stuff about the processes in our business and the systems and the where our stock is and things like that. But often it's buried in different IT systems in different places. It doesn't necessarily all connect together. And so just the process of asking data questions of our business can itself be quite difficult. And so, there's quite a big chunk of The Average is Always Wrong, the middle section of the book, which ends up being about saying, well, okay, let's assume that we understand something about data analytics. We want to do something with data, but actually the first problem we run into is, where do we get it? And so, that might be the business case for a loyalty card, for example, which is a way that, consumer businesses can kind of connect sales from the same customer together. But there are millions of other ways of doing that. It might be the business case for some IT project work that brings data together from different systems and puts it in a single place so that you can interrogate it. But one way or another, I think that the first challenge, and I think the first problem that I see business teams, leadership teams wrestling with, is this one of just, how do we get data into a place where we can interrogate it? But I think the second one is, in some senses, more insidious and more challenging, because that data problem is, in the end you can solve it, but there is another problem too, and it's the problem that the final third of The Average is Always Wrong really spends all of its time talking about, which is the challenge, the leadership and the cultural challenge of becoming a data-centric business. And this, when you talk about mistakes that business leaders make, this is what I come across more often than anything else, which is, so we understood that data was important. We did launch the loyalty card. We did do a single customer database IT transformation project. We did hire some data scientists. But yeah, I'm not really sure that's made any difference. I'm not sure my profit is particularly higher because of that. What's going wrong? And what's going wrong there is something much, much more subtle, and it's something that I think we as a a leadership community, the IoD as a business community, I think really needs to wrestle with. And Let me give you an example which I think illustrates it. So back to the retail sector, because it's what I know. If I'm the trading director in a retailer, which means I'm the person who buys, so I'm deciding what the retailer is selling next season. You know, I'm pretty senior. I'm probably one of the bigger voices in the management team. You know, that's a very influential and senior and relatively well remunerated role. But I've gotten there in my career based on a number of things, based on my ability to know customers, to read trends, to forecast what's going to be important to our sector, to buy well, to negotiate well, but not necessarily based on my ability to interrogate very large data sets. You know, there's an awful lot of the 20-25 year history of being a trading director in a retailer is about instinct and memory and kind of buying skills more than it's about kind of data analytics skills. And now somebody comes along and says, well, actually, we've got this huge data set of what people buy where. Why don't we put that through some very complicated modeling technique? And that will tell us what we should range next year. And you know what? They might be right. There might be some value in that. But as the trading director, it's perfectly possible that I am less comfortable with the idea of putting a load of data into a big model than any of the people that work for me. I'm less experienced in it than any of the people that work for me. And that is, let's be honest, that is challenging. That is existentially challenging. It threatens my seniority. It threatens my authority. It threatens my role. And it's not surprising in that circumstance that what I might do, I might exhibit a couple of behaviors. One of them is denial. So I might say, well, yeah, you can do that, but there's no substitute for instinct in our business. You know, our sector's unique. It's different to every other sector. Those techniques won't work here. You hear that a lot. Another behavior I might exhibit, if I'm a little bit more politically savvy, is I might absorb it, but try and crush it. So yeah, let's do some of that data stuff, but we'll get some consultants to do it over there, and they can come and give a presentation to the board. But meanwhile, I'm going to carry on running the proper business. And these languages, these behaviors, you know, that's not a stereotype that I'm drawing. That's a behavior that I've seen whole management teams exhibit time and time again in different businesses. And they are the recipe for change not sticking. They're the recipe for something that seemed really important to the board or really important to the CEO, not getting the traction that it might otherwise, and becoming a hobby, becoming a thing that, you know, you will pander to the board by putting a 57 slide pack in every month about data analytics, but we're not really going to change anything in the actual business that we run. And that behavior is very toxic, and it's very easy to fall into. And so, you know, again, in the context of mistakes that I see business leaders making, you know, this challenge, which, you know, we'll talk, I suspect, more about as we go through today, but this challenge of, you know, taking the idea that, you know, there's value in our data and that, you know, we might be able to change the way we organize our business, run our stores, run our sales processes, organize our call centers, you know, do our IT programs, whatever it happens to be. We might be able to change those things on the back of data. Management teams can find that really, really difficult to embrace. And so you know, as much of the conversation I have with CEOs about their business challenges, they're as much about people and about psychology as they are about technology and ones and zeros.
Thank you, Ian. That leads nicely into the next question. For CEOs and other business leaders listening to this conversation, what practical next steps they should take once they have decided to do something about it in the right way?
Well, I think that's a very practical question, and I think that you know, there are two things. So and there's, you know, candidly, there's probably 100 pages on each of these things in the book, so there's more detail in there than we're going to get to here. But if I was to try and boil up a couple of things, I think the first, and they would be in the two areas that we just talked about before. So first of all, when it comes to data itself, I think, you know, understanding that data has potential value is great, but it has to have specific value for you in your business. And so I think the first thing to do is to really think about where those opportunities might be. The audience here you know, for this call, you know, will come from a whole bunch of different sectors, a whole bunch of different sizes of business. Some will be professional services, some will be in, you know, retail and consumer, some will be B2B providers. And so for each of those businesses, the answer will be potentially different. in terms of what, where the value is for data, to really getting underneath the average and understanding the data in our business. For many, the natural place to start is the sales and marketing front end. And that's partly because, the business objective of what could we use data to drive more sales is a very tantalizing one. If you can make it happen, that's great. It's also, of course, because marketing is quite often where a lot of the data in a business is. And that's particularly true when you think about e-commerce. So, I've seen multiple businesses decide that where they're going to start really getting under the average in their data is in their e-commerce operation. You take a headline metric, our basket conversion rate is 4.7%. Terrific, but that's an average, right? And we've already established that averages are always wrong. So go one step further. But how does that split by channel? How does that split by day? How does that split by hour? How does that split by type of customer? How does that split by the product that people are buying? Really get under the skin of it. I've seen more than one business make really, really big step changes, 20, 30, 40% growth in their e-commerce business just by getting underneath that basket conversion rate and looking at the patterns of data underneath it. So there are, there's a really interesting pocket of data, but it will be different for different businesses. It might be in that stock management, working capital type area of the business. It might be many of the businesses. If you're a professional service business, for example, your world is probably a world of prospect to sales. So you've got a sort of sales funnel and a process that you're going through. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff to get underneath there in terms of the data in your business. So part one of my answer to your question in terms of where should you start, I think is really think about the data in your business and where you think there might be opportunity. And for us, we're all business leaders on this call. The way to think about that, as with all business things, is to think about cash. Where is cash tied up in your business? Where is the opportunity, and how might data help you? Because if data gives you an interesting intellectual answer but doesn't change the cash flow of your business, it's irrelevant, right? So really focusing on that is the place to start. And then the second thing to focus on is this cultural change transformation journey. And it's not just true about data, but it is true about data that it can be a difficult thing for a leadership team to get to. And I talk quite a lot in the book about how a CEO and a leadership team might come together to deal with that. But if I was to try and boil it up into a single point, it's that fear doesn't really survive in sunshine. And so actually, what I encourage leadership teams to do is to make the journey that they're going on very explicit. Hey, there's got to be value in this data. We're going to have to do some stuff. I'm the CEO at the end of the table. You know what? This is quite scary for me, all right? I'm not really sure what's going on here. I'm sure that's true for everybody around the table. What learning journey can we go on together so that we become more expert in this area? What investigation can we do looking at comparable businesses or non-competitive businesses who might be willing to share their conclusions with us? What advisors can we use who are not going to try and bamboozle us with science, but are going to try and really practically help us make it work? So let's do that together, and let's do it kind of openly acknowledging that this is a journey that we're on, which is quite intimidating and quite scary. And miraculously, once you do that, it all becomes much easier to cope with. So I think those are the areas that, so that very practically, what might our data opportunity look like? And then very kind of in a very human way, how might we go on that journey, together? Because we've all been there around the management table when the CEO pops up and says, I've just read a book about this thing, and therefore I've decided that this thing is important. And if you're not already doing this thing, you must be an idiot. And that gets you nowhere. So just imposing data centricity on a business is a hiding to nothing. But making it a journey that the whole business goes on, that's incredibly powerful.
Thank you, and thank you for a very passionate explanation on that one. The next thing, as I explained to you as a friend before, that a lot of our audience will be from SME sector. So what would you recommend to tell them? What is the big data? Is it only for big business, or is it also relevant to SMEs?
Well, I think that, it's a really good question. I'm very conscious of the sort of different types of business who are here in our gang this morning. That, I can't rule out the idea that there's somebody sat on this call thinking, there is just no value for me at any point in my business of getting underneath the averages and looking at the detail of my data. That it's got to be possible that there's a business out there for whom that's true. But I see more businesses, I think that where I think there is real material value to be gotten from getting under the skin of those averages. And I think if you might be a smaller business, but if you trade through a website, we've already talked about some interesting examples where there's a ton of data just in Google Analytics, which is free, which is probably on your e-commerce site already. There's a ton of data, and it commits exactly the sin that the book is based on, which is that the front page of Google Analytics gives you a whole bunch of averages. But there's a ton of data underneath that to get into, and there is real opportunity to be mined there. There'll be many businesses on this call, SMEs or otherwise, who've got stock, who've got cash tied up, in sales funnels, in sales processes, in prospect management, who will have, different aspects of business where you think, actually, if I can just get under the skin of that, that might be interesting. There'll be many businesses on this call for whom, perhaps I have a whole chapter in the book about what I regard as probably the simplest analytical data analytics technique, which is segmenting your customers into different groups. Not an unambiguously positive thing to do. It can be, there are downsides to doing that. But it's relatively analytically straightforward. And again, for many businesses, just understanding, what we seem to sell different products at different times of day to different people. And maybe that tells us something about how we can organize the way we present or market, or the times of day that we give out different messages, all sorts of opportunities there. So in a nutshell, yes, my contention is it is relevant for SMEs as well. And the beauty is that, and actually the great secret, for if there's people on this call who are in big businesses who've, you ask about data science and somebody from technology, the technology department comes up and says, okay, we're going to need £700,000 to hire somebody to do X, Y, and Z project for us. The beauty of data science is it's almost all free. Google Analytics is free, Python is free, the kind of MySQL is free. So actually the skills are not, unfortunately. So you do need to make sure you've got the right people doing the right things. But actually, there are very, very interesting things that you can do with relatively low investment to understand your business better and turn that into profit. And I think that is a manifesto that applies to SMEs just as much as to anybody else.
Thank you, Ian, again. This would be most probably my last question before I start taking the audience questions. There are some of them already coming through. But nevertheless, this is an important question. Who is using this big data concept very well, and what are they doing for you to say that they are doing very well?
Well, yeah, look, I think annoyingly, the people who are doing data really, really well are probably those, e-commerce businesses that, very often are businesses that have been started from scratch by people coming from a data science, kind of computer science kind of background. So interestingly, somebody in the comments just referenced banking, and you look at the new emerging banks. There's an interesting thing going on there. In the retail world, the example I always go to is Ocado, which is a fascinating business built from the ground up on data science, and I used as a case study in the book, which I think illustrates a really important point. That so Ocado used the case study of they get emails all the time. My delivery driver is late. I haven't, the eggs didn't arrive, or they were broken when they did arrive. They have all this e-commerce email traffic going into a call center somewhere. And being data scientists, it occurred to them to ask the question, I wonder if we could build a model that marked out those emails which were most urgent and needed response right now, and separated them from the emails which maybe we could take an hour to respond to. And so they did what data science people do. They whacked a whole load of historical emails into a model, some of which were urgent, some of which were not. And they used all of the data about those emails, so the language in the email, the wording, the time of day it's arrived, the length of it, all sorts of bits of data, to say, can we divide these historical emails into the urgent ones and the non-urgent ones accurately enough for that to be a useful thing to do? Because if we can, then we can apply that model to new incoming emails and maybe make our call center more customer friendly and more efficient. And they did, and it worked, and that's exactly what they do. Now, why I like that story is because, well, for a couple of reasons, but firstly, because to your point about who's doing it well, that is the type of weird question to ask about a corner of your business that would never occur to most businesses. You know, it's not about the marketing, it's not about the email traffic, you know, digital marketing, advertising traffic. It's about customer services of all things. It's a kind of, you know, for most retailers, customer services, we've got a bunch of people dealing with calls and we wish we didn't have to have that, and it's kind of dusty corner somewhere. So here's a business that thinks, no, my first question is a data question. And actually it's not about the average, right? Everybody's call center metric is, you know, average time to answer. And or can we get average time to answer from 15 minutes down to 14 minutes? Average call duration. Can we get average call duration down from 2 minutes to 1 minute 30 seconds? We're committing the sin of averages everywhere we look in a call center. And here is a business that thought, no, let's build a granular model from the bottom up. So it tells us that the value of data is often not where you expect it. It's often in odd corners of the business. And it's also a really interesting illustration of a business that is clearly applying that mentality, you know, in every corner of its operation where it can, and that I think is a really interesting object lesson for all of us.
So thanks, Ian. Now I will move to the audience questions, and we have got the first question, which came from one of our regular participants into this, Paul Hopwood. I just shortened his question. The short form of the question is, where do you stand on the ethics of using data to increase sales? I know it's a little bit pointed to you, but you can answer that as a professional.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's a terrific question, and I touch on it a little bit in the book as well. I think there are a couple of layers to this. So as business people looking to use data, I think there are, you know, you could argue maybe 3 layers to the kind of ethics question, and the first and the core one is about legality. So you know, there is quite a lot of stuff that we need to pay attention to in using data about, you know, we all talk about GDPR all the time, but what does that actually mean? And of course, what GDPR is, apart from a set of laws, is also a set of principles about using personally identifiable information in a sensible and respectful way. And that has been a kind of wrenching journey for many businesses into who've had to change how they use customer and consumer data. You know, it's a journey we're still on, because I think it's, you know, I've seen businesses, you know, really not get it and use data in ways that I think the GDPR kind of regulation probably doesn't really allow. But equally, I see people wildly over-interpreting the legislation and hamstringing themselves from doing interesting things. So I think layer 1 is probably the legal layer. You know, layer 2 is there's a very practical thing for us as businesses. I mean, very few of us on this call are running Facebook or Twitter, or, you know, things that have the potential to change the shape and course of society, which is the top layer I'm going to come to. But we do all have customers. And so that the kind of practical, ethical layer about using data, which I talk about a bit in the book, is about saying, actually, a really useful rule of thumb is if your customers knew you were building that model and doing that thing, would they be completely fine with that? And very often the answer is yes. So, you know, building the model that says, I'm about to launch a new product and I'd like to know which of my customer base are most likely to be interested in it. You know, the pub conversation about that doesn't sound particularly bad. On the other hand, you know, there are models that you can build that make people wince a little bit. And I have some fun in the book with examples of, you know, if you send customers an email saying, you know, you've bought more ready meals than anyone else in your town, you know, would you like to subscribe to my diet service? You know, that as a supermarket selling ready meals would be a really bad email to send, and it's a bad model to build because it doesn't pass the customer test. I think so that layer, I think, is where most of us will spend most of our time thinking about ethics, which is, are we doing things that create things that our customers would value? I think the implication of the reference to the Social Dilemma documentary and Paul's question is probably the layer above that, which is, you know, are there broader societal kind of ethical issues here? And I think for very few of us in very few businesses is that true, frankly. I think, you know, for most of us, it's about, you know, really kind of, getting the right messages to the right customers in the right way at the right time. And I think that is, that has its own set of constraints. But I think the Social Dilemma documentary is both brilliant and horrifying. If anybody on the call hasn't seen it, you should. I don't think it's necessarily the world in which most of us are operating, however.
Thank you, Ian. The next question came from, again, one of our non-executive directors, Philip French. And Philip's question is, any suggestions on how those of us who are NEDs can improve the basic mathematics and statistical numeracy of boards?
Well, it's a really good question, and there is a reason. Well, without wanting to use that as a flagrant sales pitch, the first third of The Average is Always Wrong is entirely about, actually, strangely enough, demystifying the maths that behind data, because I think we go a bit blind sometimes to if you are you may not have done maths since you were at school, and somebody starts talking about, well, I've got this whizzy model, and that can feel very intimidating, but actually a lot of what's going on, the math sometimes that's going on to generate a model, is potentially quite complicated, but interpreting it is not. Actually what I encourage, I'm also an NED, and what I encourage businesses to do is just gently, just get behind the average. So, if you're going to show me, for example, I don't know, the conversion rate of our sales team. Let's say we're a B2B business and we have a load of salespeople out in the field making sales, and the conversion of our sales team from sales calls to confirmed sales is whatever it is, 2%. Great, but the next question a board should be asking is, can I just see the scatter chart of everyone that makes up that average of 2%? Because actually, simply by eyeballing a chart with granular data on it, I'm probably going to end up doing some very sophisticated analytical techniques by accident in my head, because I'm going to segment. I'm going to say, well, look, those folks over there in that region seem to be doing better than these folks over here. I wonder if that's significant. What are they doing differently? And now you're into a conversation that's one step under the average. So I think my answer to Philip and to everybody else is to be really pragmatic about it. That this is, this is not about understanding the kind of, the optimization variable that goes into a neural network and, how important it is that you get that number right. This is about understanding that when somebody says our customers visit us on average 3 times a month, that there's 1 or 2 more questions you ought to ask. I talk in the book about just understanding things like standard deviation, so the variability in data. And again, anybody who studied stats at school or at university, you say standard deviation and all our hair falls out, because you start thinking about that, the sum of the square minus the thing divided by the square root of the thing, and it makes your head hurt. But actually, that's nothing to do with our jobs running business. What is to do with our jobs running business is understanding that data that a series of data points that all cluster very closely together is telling you one thing, and a series of data points that are very, very spread out is telling you something else, even if they both have the same average number. And so asking a question about the standard deviation, or again, just asking to see the plot of the raw data, you're beginning to get into that. And the whole world of machine learning and AI is just basically turbocharging that. So for me, the place to start is just don't be comfortable with summary averages. And, there's a story I tell in the book about, a marketing agency saying to a retailer, well, this, of the products that you sell, this product over indexes with people over 65. And I've been in this room, right? Genuinely been in this room. The whole of the rest of the conversation is, well, that's the old person product, right? That's the over indexes with the over 65. So if we're going to make a TV ad about that product, it's going to feature, people wearing slippers and sitting by the fire and, petting their Cocker Spaniel and all the rest, because it's the old person product. And yet actually, if, on average, we sell 10% of our products to older folks, and we sell 15% of that particular product to older folks, then it's technically true to say it over indexes with older people, but it's still true that 85% of the people buying it are not older. And so that's an example where, sometimes we get bamboozled by these presentations and by these indices and statistics. Just encourage your management teams to go one step further, and a lot of value will be unlocked from that.
So Ian, you did answer this question on the sideline, but maybe you can give a very crisp answer to this one. It comes from Howard, and he's asking, are the banking industry parallels applicable here, and could we learn from them? because he's talking about channel shift from telephone banking to internet banking. And then
yeah, look, I think that I don't know the banking sector as well as I suspect other people on this call do, so I'm not going to attempt to offer an expert opinion on that, except that, of course, I'm a customer, and both as a business and as an individual. And what I would, what I think I would absolutely echo in the implication of that question is that many of the challenges that I think many of our businesses either have or will have as we try to become data centric, you can absolutely see writ large in the financial services sector. So you can see, the kind of ghastly mishmash of IT systems that many big banks have. I know a few people who work in banks, and I don't like talking to them about IT because it makes me scared for my money. So the kind of that whole issue of we've got pockets of data, doesn't talk to each other. We haven't necessarily got a single view of the customer or the journey or anything like that. They absolutely have that problem. Then you have these upstart new starts coming along who don't have the legacy problems that you have, and therefore the kind of challenge that comes from that. And yes, I suspect you have some of the same kind of cultural and leadership issues as well. Of we've always done it this way, we've always made decisions that way, and so changing it can be really difficult. And I wrote another book a year or two ago called Reinventing Retail, about the challenges facing retailers, and one of the things I talked about there was the difficulty that incumbent businesses have in some senses sacrificing the kind of the thing that makes money today in order to generate the thing that makes money in the future. And I think you see that in the banking sector a lot, that it's very hard to kill your own profit stream in order to build a new one for the future. The only thing that's worse, however, than doing that is allowing a new entrant to do it to you. And I think you can see a lot of that. You see it in the retail sector. I suspect you see it in financial services as well.
The next question comes from our attendee, Robert Weston. The question is, it's a customer side of dilemma. So if the customer asks you, I know how the data benefits you, but how does it benefit me? So the question that he's been asking is, have you looked at how data can help customers, in particular B2B customers?
Yeah, and look, I think Robert's question is a really, really salient one in both B2B and B2C. And again, I am more, it will have become very apparent during the course of this call, more a consumer industry veteran than a B2B industry veteran. So again, I won't attempt to pretend to be expert at something that I'm not. But this issue of the value exchange is a really important one, and I think you see that. I see that in the retail sector, for example, where an obvious alternative to all the time and expense of launching a loyalty card in order to identify those anonymous transactions that happen in my store, and an obvious alternative to that is simply to ask you for your email address when you're at the till. And that started the guise in which that started was, can I have your email address in order to email you your receipt? Because we are saving the environment by not printing out receipts. And that, I think that works to a certain extent, but you have a growing set of consumers who go, hang on a minute, what you actually want is then just to spam me with emails for the rest of my life, just in that sense of the value of their own data and identity. And I think the answer is, if your intention genuinely is to spam them with emails for the rest of their lives, you're probably on a hiding to nothing. Because firstly, actually, that's not a very good data strategy anyway. But secondly, yes, it will get harder and harder to get people to share data with you if what you're doing is not in their interests. If, on the other hand, I want to gather your data, for example, in a B2B sense, because we write thought pieces every now and again, and some of them might be interesting to you, and we run events that might be relevant to you, or I wanted to sort of share some benchmarks with you. I want to know how you use my products in order that when a new thing comes along, a new technology comes along, I can introduce it to you appropriately. If you're sincere about that, and if you have a reputation for being sincere about that, then people will exchange data with you willingly. So the reality is that I think for many businesses, getting you to give me your email address and sign up is getting harder and harder. But the harsh reality is it's getting harder and harder because most of those transactions are not in the interest of the customer. They are in the interest of the business. And I think that's what we need to change, because in the end, spamming gets you nowhere. It's a short-term drug in terms of its impact on your numbers, but it doesn't really get you anywhere.
Thank you, Ian. The next question is slightly deep technically, but I will anyway put
Oh,
it
God.
forth to you. Matt Vickers. Matt is saying data is seen as a competitive advantage. We might tend to a world of data modes. Yet many of the problems and opportunities might sit in a more open source approach. What advice would you give on thinking through that open source versus data mode question? I know it's technical, so you don't have to answer.
Well, look. I think that it's a really interesting one. I think that I've seen. I mean, obviously, there's a technical thing about do I have my data in-house or do I have it in a cloud somewhere, which I think is a different question to the one that Matt's addressing, because that's just about where you store the data. And I tend to, having seen some quite horrific data center issues, tend to a kind of cloud orientation on that. But I don't think that's the sort of really the substance of Matt's question. I think the substance of Matt's question is about, do I keep my information private, or do I do some kind of ecosystem approach where we take a broader view of these things? And I've seen both, actually. I've seen industries which have greatly improved themselves through an open approach. And actually, my last, where I was in cinema, is a really interesting example. Cinema data is very open within, not open to us particularly, but within the industry, because it's a revenue share model. So there is a data service you can subscribe to, which you can see who bought how many tickets for which showings of every showing in every cinema in the UK, for example, including your competitors. It's all done in a very open way, and that's fantastic if you're good at using data to draw conclusions. And we had a great time at Odeon building models on that data and working out things like pricing strategies accordingly. So there certainly are examples where I think where industry-wide sort of data approaches are useful. But there are also, of course, many examples of what we're talking about here where actually what you want is competitive advantage. And so, I think it's probably more common that, the value in your data is for you, and it's probably better kept for you. But I do encourage businesses. There's businesses I'm talking to at the moment where I'm thinking actually some sort of aggregated approach, to the extent that you can get it to happen, does unlock a lot of value as well.
Thank you, Ian. The next question that I would like to put forth to you is from Barney Stickles, and his question is following on from Una's question. I won't go that deep, but let me come straight to the question. Basically, the question is asking you to give good organizational design models that have been implemented to support data centricity as a model itself.
Yes, no, but I think I saw Brian's question, and it's a really, it's one that, frankly, any of us, and I'm sure all of us on this call, have spent hours agonizing about organizational models for one reason or another. And I talk about this quite a lot in the book, again, in the sense of, so if you're on this journey towards becoming a data-centric business, what is the right way to organize yourself? And I think the good news and the bad news, the good news is that every possible organizational structure has been tried and has worked. The bad news is they've also all failed in different circumstances. And so, I've seen data ownership and data kind of centricity and analytics led by the finance function. I've seen it led by the IT function. I've seen it led by the marketing function. I've seen it led by, having a chief data officer who does it as a separate kind of part of the business. Just, you name it, report directly to the CEO, you name it, every organizational model has been tried. The thing that really separates, however, the organizations that succeed on their journey towards data centricity from those which don't is the temperament and the attitude and the approach of whoever it is that owns data analytics in that business. Because if you put your data charge, your data mission into the hands of somebody who then thinks, great, that's mine, and I'm going to do some stuff, and we'll rock up at the board with some clever slides, and we'll just look so much cleverer than everybody else in the business, you're going nowhere, because you're right back to that denial and organizational treacle. On the other hand, if you put your data analytics journey in the hands of somebody who wants to share it, who wants to be, who wants to push out into across the business, and that's partly about temperament and personality. It's also partly, frankly, about organizational authority and kind of gravitas and seniority and all that sort of stuff, then all sorts of good things can happen. And so I use the example in the book, I've literally seen the same strategy, which is same organizational strategy, which in that particular case was having a chief commercial officer who ran sales, marketing, and digital, and also the data analytics piece. I can give you a worked example of that failing dismally and a worked example of it succeeding really well. And the only difference was effectively, frankly, the personality of the person in the role, and their expansiveness and their ability to kind of draw the organization with them. So as I suppose with all organizational stuff, people and personality matters more than lines on a chart.
Thank you, Ian. That nicely takes me to the next question coming from Robert. And the question is, you talk about toxic behaviors at SMT level and blocking the intentions of the board. What have you learned from your experiences at unblocking this in regard to the data-centric journey?
Yeah, I like I say, I think my slightly glib line from before, which is that fear doesn't survive in sunshine, I think that is to me the core of the approach, which is you've got to call it out. So you've got to be clear about saying, let's say you gather your management team together. Item 1 on the agenda is we want to do more with data and analytics. You have a great conversation. Maybe you've got some expert around the table that's either in your business or brought in for that purpose, who you have a really, really interesting conversation. A little bit later in the day, when you're a couple of agenda points further on, you catch somebody around the table saying, yeah, but of course our industry is a bit different to everyone else, and what matters is our kind of our history and our knowledge and our instinct. And you go, well, hold on a minute, let's bring that out into the sunshine, because that is both true, because it's true for every business is different and every business is unique and every business's organizational memory matters, is both true and really toxic. And you've got to draw that out and have the conversation. And the strange thing that happens is when you do that, everybody laughs and goes, "Oh yeah, you got me." That's true, right? And what you're starting to do as a management team then, in an interesting way, is to build a conversational currency around the fact that you're all on this journey together. There's a big retailer. This is a different topic. It's digital rather than data, but there's a big retailer who really wanted to grasp the idea of social media. And what is Snapchat anyway? What do people do with that? My 15-year-old's got Snapchat, but I don't really know what it is. They all got themselves as social media mentors. So they recruited 17, 18-year-olds from their own stores and from their own warehouse, and paired them up with members of the board to act as their advisors and their guide and their mentors. And that's really interesting for two reasons. Firstly, it was a knowledge transfer. So it was a bit of, they learned something. But more importantly, and the bit that's relevant to our conversation here about data, is it was a very, very open way of the management team saying there are things we don't know, and there are things that we need to know. And I think that is the thing that you've got to do in a business, and it's not easy. Some of the entrenched, what your questioner characterized as toxic behaviors, are very few people who are senior in business are dumb enough to just come into the room and go, "I'm not doing that. I don't like it." So that's not what you get. What you get is, that's a great idea, and now I'm going to put it in this cupboard over here and not worry about it until next month's meeting. And you've got to be quite alert to catching those behaviors. But I think the management team that does that together, almost as part of their team building journey, just suffers much less problem with that toxicity than the one that doesn't.
Thank you, Ian. This might be my last question, so maybe I can squeeze in one more. But Pakita is asking, what examples do you have of how collaboration between competitors in sharing data can bring shared benefit? And again, do you have any examples where it has worked very well, where they have realized the benefits they could not have done otherwise?
Yeah, look, it's a really, it brings me back to my cinema example. It's a really interesting point. It's, of course, in some sense very difficult for competitors to share data, both because frankly I want to win against my competitors, but also legally. You've got to be quite sensitive to, here we are under the auspices of the IoD, champions of training on directors' responsibilities, and you do have to be a bit careful about throwing around data in a competitive marketplace. But where it, so often the practical impact of that is people use aggregate third parties. So there'll be a market research firm, or there'll be a some way of creating a kind of overall view that everybody contributes to, and then everybody benefits from. The thing that really, where I get very exercised about that, and I've written about it a bit in The Average is Always Wrong, and actually a lot in my previous book about retailing, is that it unlocks something incredibly powerful for a business, because what it unlocks is the measurement of market share. And many businesses have only an intuitive understanding of their position versus their competitors, but not a very granular one. And again, the retail hospitality sectors that I work with, you know what your sales were yesterday, and frankly, you know what your sales were in every 5-minute period of yesterday. But if you don't know what your competitors' sales were, you're missing a key ingredient in terms of understanding the competitive dynamic. And so, yes, I think those businesses, where those industry sectors where more data sharing is possible, where you can create more data sharing, the first prize to go for is, I really want to be able to therefore understand, when I make a pricing change, when I do a promotional thing, when I make an organizational change, when I hire a new sales team, whatever it happens to be, if I've got a market share metric in my business, I can see whether or not that's made a difference to my position in the market. And that's a prize that's well worth investing in.
Ian, I am tending to squeeze one, but maybe a very quick answer, because it's a good point. Richard Maybury is asking, democratizing data, is that a good strategy then?
Well, I think there's probably a longer conversation to be had about what we mean by democratizing data. I think that, as I say, in some circumstances, the sharing data in the way that I've described, I think unlocks a lot of things. But it's only one of the prizes, and I think many of the quick wins that businesses on this call and participating in events like this can get from understanding their data, are just about understanding their data. Yeah, they're just about getting under the surface, looking at those scatter charts, understanding the differences, finding the pockets of why is that surprisingly profitable, or why is that surprisingly unprofitable, and what am I going to do about that pocket of data? There's a ton to be going at there. So I think that I wouldn't necessarily start with the kind of cross-industry structural stuff, because it can be really hard to make it happen. I think I'd start just by rejecting averages when they're presented to me in slide packs. That would be a good place to start, because Raj, the average is always wrong.
Thank you, and that's a very nice note to finish off with, but we're not done yet. I may request all the participants to turn their videos on, because then we can take a group photo digitally. But Ian, thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion, and I really look forward to welcoming you again very soon. And hopefully by that time, you might be able to do it physically. So before I say anything else, the first thing that I would like to do is thank to our lovely audience, who have been fantastic.
Yes.
Without them, this conversation could not have been as lively as it has been today. I will wait for some other colleagues to turn their cameras on, but before they turn it on, I would also request that we give a good round of applause to Juliet Rushent and Julie Jones from IoD, who are the people. Juliet, you are in, so if you could just show yourself.
Absolutely.
We should thank them, because they do the real grunt work. We do appearing and disappearing acts, that's all we do. So thanks a lot to Julie and Juliet. And I will quickly take a couple of digital photographs, because last time Juliet told me it did not come very well. So with that, I would also like to basically thank all of my audience who have given up their precious time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And just to let you know, we are going to take a basically Christmas break this time. So we will not have this series in December, but we will be in touch with you for the January speaker, and we'll resume in January. So if I don't see you in my next networking event, have a lovely Christmas. Enjoy with family, if you can, under the law. And I look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.